Okay, welcome back to lecture 2 for week 2. So we're going to pick up and just kind of do a quick review of, just give you a little bit more perspective of different regions to tie it in with a little bit about mental maps and give you an introduction to globalization, which globalization is an underlying theme for this course as we talk about different regions. I'm just going to I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is a different perspective. This is if I asked you what kind of regions this would be, this is obviously formal regions. It's based on state boundaries. Yet it is a very perceptive map because obviously Armed and God-Fearing is not the name of Texas. Retired Pop Stars is not the name of Nevada, and Fake Boobs and Oranges is not the name of California. And then you've got you got Catholics, New Italy, canned sardines, mad scientists, and statisticians, which honestly I don't know how, I guess Maryland, but anyways. So this just gives you a different perspective, and then this is the same resource. You can see the source down here. This is the same link where you can go and get the one for the world as well if you wanted to look at that one. So outlines. Today we're going to go over, I think I do. Did I keep those in there? Yeah, the geographic analysis assignments. Just give you a really quick introduction to those mental maps and vernacular perceptual regions. And then we're going to talk about globalization, which is from chapter 1. It's pages 7 to 14. So your geographic analysis assignment, your first one is due in a couple weeks. If you go to, so the first one you have to choose between chapters 1 and 2. If you go to the very last pages of each chapter, so chapter 1 is page 41 and chapter 2 is page 65, there's a little section up in the top right corner called the data analysis section. Sorry, I'm not having you do the groups of this, but you'll be provided with a grading rubric. It's a very similar rubric as to sorry if I can think correctly, it's very similar to the discussion element, just grading wise. But next Friday, it'll be next Sunday that your assignment is due. Just follow the deadline on the syllabus. But just to give you an idea of where you can find those specifically in your book. So going back to region, types of region. So we talked about formal or universal regions. These are defined by a set of features that is present throughout the region, throughout the area. Functional regions, defined by their functional integration or activities, the extent of primary activities that define the regions. A vernacular or a perceptual regions. These are kind of like your mental maps that we'll be doing. Regions that people believe to exist, a mental image. So if we go back to the first one, fake boobs and oranges. Fake boobs and oranges is not really all of California. And again, this comes from where you live. So somebody from New York might think fake boobs and oranges. Somebody from West Virginia might think fake boobs and oranges. But somebody from Northern California is not going to think fake boobs and oranges. So note that there are diversities within regions and that these features may change from one area of the region to the other as well as over time. So here's just a couple more examples that would clarify. So we have formal regions. So this is based on political boundaries. We have, anyone want to take a guess? Climate. So it's a formal region. We got functional regions. So this is watersheds and water resources and waterways. This is functional, so it's based on activities. Might not necessarily be economic activities, but it is still specific water activities, for example, water resources. And then we've got vernacular perceptual regions. These are probably my favorite. Okay, so can you locate? This will give you your thing. It's just a map. So can you locate the Southwest? Which states, which regions, not even doesn't have to be state boundaries, but which regions of these would be Southwest? Which states would be considered in the Southwest? How about the Midwest? The Northwest. Now, the thing is that we were in an actual class and not in a virtual classroom. It would be really interesting to compare and see what, Oklahoma. Is Oklahoma the Southwest, the Midwest? Obviously, it's not the Northwest. Idaho, is that the Midwest, the Northwest? How would these be defined? And largely, these differ based on where you are from. So what features characterize each of these regions? As you have gone ahead and divided these regions, how would you characterize them? So why is the Southwest the Southwest? What makes it different than the Midwest? What makes it different than the Northwest? Are you thinking about weather? Are you thinking about the people that live there? Maybe the economic activities. Maybe you're thinking about the accents that they might have. So there's a lot of different things that are involved in our perceptions of different regions. So again, this is another one that we saw yesterday, our last one. So mental maps, the last lecture. Maps of the world with all sorts of biases and assumptions. These are huge things to understand. They are full of biases and assumptions. Many ideas are embedded in our separate cognitive maps. So we all have these and they're embedded in our mind. When we hear of a place, you hear a name of a place, some image automatically comes to your mind. And part of what I like to do in this class is to get students to understand and think about what images come to your mind, if any, but what comes to your mind, which is the purpose of doing our mental map activity, so that you're a little bit more open to learning about that region. So these are based on prior and current exposures. And the media is a huge role in this. News, Facebook, even if you've met people from those areas as well. So cognitive or mental maps reflect certain historical and cultural views of that time. So your views of a specific region, a specific place, might differ significantly than that of your parents or your grandparents or somebody from a different culture as well. So if I ask you, for example, list the 3 most desirable states in the United States for you to live in, I'm assuming a lot of you would say Hawaii. Desirable does not necessarily have to say that you're taking into consideration the economic cost. Most people also tend to think California, Florida. Never have students mention North Dakota. North Dakota actually has a lot of economic opportunities, a lot of jobs available, partially related to maybe people who don't want to live there. Colorado, New York also tend to be big hits. But I'm thinking maybe, some people now go for Portland and Seattle as well. So again, if we were in a class, it would be in an actual classroom. It would be really interesting to see where you're from influences where you would choose. So here's a mental map for Minnesota. So they ask people in Minnesota, where would you want to live? Well, you can see, so they've got the dot there of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and people where they shaded it in. We've got California, we've got Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and that looks like it. They asked people from Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania would do parts of New England, southern New England, I should say, New York, and they would do part of Southern California. Not anywhere in California, just part of Southern California. So again, I have to say, if I go back to Minnesota, there were just parts of it, a lot more parts of it, but just parts of it. Alabama, people in Alabama would be willing to live in Alabama, part of Georgia, Florida, and a very tiny pocket, I'm assuming that's Los Angeles, of California. North Dakota. Ironically, no one in North Dakota apparently wants to live in North Dakota. However, they are willing to live in the Denver area and pretty much anywhere on the West Coast. I think this is absolutely hilarious to see this. So again, you can see how drastically people's desires can vary depending on where they're from. So here's just a couple more perspectives. These are just kind of for fun. American point of view. So we've got the United States. You notice how huge it is versus the rest of the world. Now this has been identified. So we've got surfing, where we're from. Not surfing, surfing. Hunting. Not sure what they're hunting. And why hunting is out in the middle of the ocean. Fishing. Exploiting, down there for Central South America. And the rest of the world is for fighting. Just, take a step back. Exploiting, most of you probably wouldn't think of. Fighting, a lot of people tend to think of this. And, this is not a stance of pro or, contra military force of the United States. But this is literally what most people think of. We think of Korea, when we think of Vietnam, when we think of Germany, when we think of Iraq, when we think of the Middle East, a lot of this goes to the warfare, and North Korea as well. A lot of the current conflicts that we're seeing. There's a link here for this one. The World According to America. This was not made by Americans. This was made, looks like it's from the UK. It was made to make fun of Americans. So US, land of the free and of the brave, etc. Again, this is based on stereotypes. Canada is our friendly but backwards neighbors. You can see up north, we've got cold. Santa Claus lives here. I'm assuming it's supposed to be Cuba. We've got commies. They want to destroy our great democracy with their cigars. Mexico, smelly people with big hats. And then they're going off to Asia. See how America valiantly defends itself by bombing small countries. Commies, all commies over there in Asia. Vietnam over here somewhere. Commies are our enemies. They must be destroyed. Down there, what I'm assuming is supposed to be Australia. It says here be something else. We got Europe over there. No TV or escalators. Theme parks. Go see the Queen. England, Scotch and Ireland, which is spelled wrong. Disney and McDonald's. Everybody loves them. Commies, more commies up there. It should be part of Russia, I'm assuming. And the rest of the world is just here be dragons. No civilization. People eat each other here. This is a good play on Americans and our very closed views of the world. So here's the same one from the other day. Here's the specific link if you wanted to go find it. Okay, so globalization. What is it? It's a huge part of this class and what we're going to be talking about. Is it good? Is it bad? Most of you have heard of it at some point in your life, I'm hoping. So globalization, what is it? Take a minute. What is it? What are your previous perceptions of globalization? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it ugly? What are the trends you associate with globalization? So just take a couple minutes to think about these. What are some positive aspects of globalization? And what are some negative implications of globalization? Just take a couple minutes before I just delve in and give you the answers, which actually I won't, is good, bad, ugly. I'm not necessarily going to tell you. These are based on individual opinions. So the concept of globalization, I'm sorry, I actually just realized that part of that covered my text up there. So according to Global Babel, there are hundreds of definitions of globalization. We're talking about a borderless world, end of nation states, which basically means countries. We'll talk about this later. Homogenizing culture, global free market economy, quote unquote neoliberalism. We will talk about this as well. Producing global equality, producing global inequality. Power concentrated, power dispersed. Globalization is a myth. Nothing has really changed. I think just the fact that we have McDonald's in how many different languages up here? I'm gonna guess 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm supposed to be 9 somewhere else. Just the existence of McDonald's around the world is a pretty good indicator that we can't say globalization doesn't exist. So globalization, according to your book, refers to the interconnectedness of people and places through the converging processes of economic, political, and cultural change. This will most likely be on your exam. So we're talking about the interconnectedness of people and places around the globe through these different processes. Converging, they come together, they mix together. Economic processes, political processes, and cultural change. It is an ongoing and historical process. As you will see in the next few minutes, it is not new. It's causing the most fundamental reorganization of the world's socio-economic structure since the Industrial Revolution. So, early globalization, realistically, we can track it back to the Silk Road. Many people would consider this to be early globalization, which was believed to have started approximately around 200 before the Christian era, BCE. So, according to this, globalization is more than 2,000 years old. What we tend to think of as globalization is not the Silk Road. The Silk Road or Silk Route was an ancient network of trade routes So basically connected the East to the West, or China, Southeast Asia to Europe, largely for trading routes. Then we also have the spice trade. So spice trade refers to the trade, quite similar, but it was more maritime, between historical civilizations in Asia, Northeast Africa, and Europe, potentially originated even further, around 3000 BC or BCE, as evidence from Neolithic times. So this is generally associated with driving the world economy from the end of the Middle Ages well into the modern times. And this is what, quote unquote, ushered in an age of European domination in the East. The Atlantic slave trade is another, I want to say, excellent example of globalization. It's kind of like saying Hitler was an excellent leader. He might not have been an excellent person, but he was an excellent leader to get that many people to follow and listen to him. The Atlantic slave trade is a great example of globalization. So, for 1526, the first trip was made from Portugal to Brazil. It wasn't quote unquote from Portugal, but it was a Portuguese ship. Estimated, so the last trip that allegedly was made was to the United States in 1859. This was an illegal trip. Actually, I should say that was the last trip to the United States. Portugal ended the last trade route in the 1870s, and it was estimated that 12 million survivors were brought to the Americas. By that, we are excluding the millions of people that would have died. There's a really interesting, quick little short YouTube video if you want to check it out, and it shows you the massive amounts of people that were brought over in the ships that came. So the Industrial Revolution, where did this modern globalization begin? A lot of times we go back in history. We have to go back to understand what's happening in the present. So to give you a quick catch up, sorry about that. So the Industrial Revolution, transition to new manufacturing processes, and rise of the factory system. It started in the United Kingdom and England. The first step of this happened, the first stage was from 1716 to 1840. It began in Great Britain. By the mid-18th century, Britain controlled a global trading empire with political influence, went from cottage industries to factories. A major turning point in history. Almost every aspect of daily life was influenced in some way. So income, population, which obviously had then connections to healthcare, disposable income, time, labor laws, poverty, population indicators. It affected everything or influenced everything, and really was the rise of capitalism, or we call industrial capitalism. Well, what I want you to understand is that globalization is not new. Just, we talked about the silk trade, we talked about the spice trade, we talked about the slave trade. And not only is that, but globalization really is not a new process. But the scale, the scope, and the pace of today's globalization is much bigger and faster. So Robert P. Clark, geographer who wrote a book called The Global Imperative, he quotes, today's globalization process differs from that in earlier times in three ways. The volume of materials moved is larger, the speeds at which they moved are faster, and the diversity of materials, so the matter, the energy, the information moved is greater. 15 years ago, I guess 15 years ago we had it, 20 years ago, a lot of American homes were just gaining access to internet. 30 years ago, homes did not have internet. 40 years ago, it was unfathomable. Just the access to telephones. You don't even need to sit down at a computer now. You guys, more than anything, are a generation that has grown up with these resources. I always love to look at those videos in BuzzFeed does it where they show the kids, oh, look, what is this? And it's like a VCR player. But it is unfathomable for people who have lived in this type of society with access to these types of materials. But the thing is that the degree to what is being moved, not just physically, but information as well, the speeds, the diversity of material is faster, larger, and bigger than it ever has been in the history of globalization. So globalization impacts and is experienced by more people than ever today as well. So globalization in the environment. So some of the ways that globalization is having influences. So we've seen economic growth has been intensified. This has greatly intensified the resource extraction around the world. There is the statistic, I'm not sure what it is today. In the last few years, it tends to be that we would need 5 globes, 5 planet Earths, just to meet the needs of Americans, which we are a minute fraction of the global population, over 7 billion, and we are about 0.33 billion people. Commodification of natural resources is a major problem. So commodification, we are putting prices on natural resources and we are selling them. Waste disposals and environmental impacts beyond borders. So this is a huge issue now with globalization. So not only do we extract natural resources, which cause environmental destruction in other places, but then what are we going to do with our waste? We will just go and dump it elsewhere. I just read they were talking about after Christmas, the amount of stuff that is returned to stores. So stores actually don't sell this, or they can't sell it. And there's it's like 60% of what is purchased, or some ridiculous amount, is actually sent to landfills in foreign countries. It's astounding to think in my mind that good products that somebody didn't want can end up that way. And then we also are seeing this concept of economic externalities, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So at local and global scale. So externalities is if you go to Walmart and you buy a t-shirt for $4. If you watch the story of stuff, I think they give a pretty good description of, they talk about externalities. I don't know if they actually define it as economic externalities, but I go to Walmart and I buy a t-shirt for $4. There is no way that that t-shirt could really cost $4 to make. It might have cost them, I don't know, let's say $3 or 3 cents to pay the person in Malaysia to sew the t-shirt. It cost them so much in fuel to send it here and then to get it off the boat and then to get it in the store and to pay the cashier and to pay for the electricity in the store. All of those are factors. It might be covering all of those costs, or at least contributing some minuscule amount to all of those costs. But what is it not covering? It's not covering the negative environmental consequences of growing that cotton in India. It's not covering the healthcare costs of the worker who had to go and pick the cotton after the pesticides were sprayed. It's not covering the healthcare costs for the birth defects for the child or the medical conditions for the child that was in the mother's womb as she was out picking the cotton after the fields had been immediately sprayed. It is not covering the carbon that has been released from the boats or from the transportation that got the cotton to the factories, that got the cotton to the factories that made the fabric, that then took the fabric to the factories that sewed the shirt, that then brought the shirt sewn to the United States to then be turned around and sold to Hawaii, right? It's not covering the carbon releases of any of that. It's not covering the environmental consequences of spraying the pesticides. So there's a lot of externalities, things that are not being considered in the price of that t-shirt. And then we also see this trend of global environmental treaties, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and we will talk about all of these as well. So globalization changes cultural practices. How so? What is culture, first of all? Culture is a way of life. Culture is patterns of behavior and attitudes. It's learned and shared by members of a society, in a nutshell. Culture is often self-enforced by a set of values that are passed on and preserved by society members. We all prescribe to our culture and/or our subcultures. Culture is represented in the ideas, the languages, the belief systems, the knowledge systems, the materials. So, for example, locally, fish hooks, boomboxes, houses, books, and the institutions. Patriarchy, property rights. How we do things, our ideas, and the things that we make or we use. All of these are concepts of culture. So globalization changes cultural practices for the good and for the bad. So some of these things that we see, so it changes cultural practices. You can all think of these. Think of examples where other countries it changes language. We speak Spanglish. We have a lot of words. Ellis Island has a huge graph. They used to have a huge chart on the wall, which shows you all of these different words that we use in American English that aren't actually from English, but they come from other countries. And some of them, schmuck, you might know is Yiddish. But there's a lot of words that we aren't aware that are actually not English words. It's globalization has led to this huge global consumer culture that is continually spreading throughout the world. Spread of different values. A lot of countries have tried to make attempts to keep out these changing values. A change in diets. Fast food is the best example. A lot of countries are now struggling with overweight and obesity issues, just as the United States is, because of a change in diets. Change in language, change in media, music, movies. American cinema and television shows are quite dominant around the world, and a part of this is availability of economic resources as well. But there's a lot of nations. Nigeria was found to be the oddest example of a country. What do they call it? Nollywood? I forget. It's basically a spin-off of Bollywood, which is then a spin-off of Hollywood. And finally, population movements. So we have seen unprecedented border crossings, and this is a recurring thing that we'll talk about as well. So not only just people who are involuntarily crossing borders or people who are illegally crossing borders, but we are talking about anybody and everybody crossing a border. So geopolitics and globalization. So geopolitics is a term that we use to describe the close link between geography and politics. So we focus on the interactivity between political power is a main word here, and the territory at all scales, from the local to the global. Globalization is not restricted by boundaries, and this is not just for politics, this is obviously for environmental issues as well. An example is the United Nations, which is an international government structure where allegedly all countries are represented, and we will talk about the UN quite a lot this semester. International criminal element is another huge issue that we're seeing with globalization and geopolitics. So international drug trade, human trafficking, prostitution. We see weakened political power of individual states through the creation of the World Trade Organization, WTO, and the European Union, which has thus created a sentiment of nationalism, and a lot of all of this has actually border crossings as well, a huge sentiment of nationalism that's growing throughout the United States and has been growing throughout many right-leaning countries in Europe as well. These are some of the major factors that have influenced this right movement in the UK, and then the vote for Brexit, for the UK to leave the European Union. And finally, I'm got ahead of myself, creation of separatist movements. For example, the EU with the UK, and then you get this in other countries as well. Catalonia in Spain, Scotland from the UK as well. So just a little quick bit here on global human trafficking. So it's estimated that every year from 2 to 4 million people become victims of human trafficking. 50% of those victims are children. It's one of the most lucrative illegal global businesses, and approximately almost 21 million victims of trafficking worldwide as of 2012. So that's not including the last 5 years. And it's believed that 1.5 million victims in the United States alone. Economic globalization and uneven development. Globalization is often professed to erase the gap between the rich and the poor and solve these problems. Regarding uneven development. Some of the things we've seen is global communication systems. This is definitely, I would say, one of the positives of globalization. Transportation systems, moving goods and people quickly. That could be good, that could be bad. If we're talking about diseases, not good. If we're talking about medical supplies, that's good. Transnational corporations, global corporations, more powerful than governments. These are everywhere, and I'll give you some examples. New and more flexible forms of capital accumulation, going back to capitalism, going back to neoliberalism. So there are constantly new and quote unquote more flexible forms of accumulating capital, of getting rich and making money, outsourcing. People now, YouTube is just an example. People can make money by posting videos of how to do something. My cousin's kid apparently wants to become a YouTube video. She's in second grade, by the way. She wants to become a YouTube star, and she asks her mom to film her and post things to Facebook. Like, she's not allowed to have a YouTube account. She's not allowed to have Facebook either. She's like 7 years old. Free trade agreements. We will talk about these. You will see this as a constant reminder for every region. Market economies, private enterprises replace state-controlled economies and services. This is a huge factor of capitalism, and even more so of neoliberalism, which we'll talk about. Exacerbated economic disparities. The gap between the rich and the poor has not closed. It has only gotten gravely worse, including within our own nation. And we're also seeing huge, massive amounts of migration, illegal as well as legal. So illegal, for example, regarding Mexico, and legal when we talk about, quote unquote, the Middle East. We'll talk about Dubai, where I cannot think of the statistic off the top of my head, but I want to say it's like 95% of the residents are actually resident workers from abroad. So transnational corporations, your book gives you a pretty thorough definition, but some that you can be aware of: Walmart, Mattel, General Electric, Nike, Dole, Hilton. These are all examples of transnational corporations, and in many cases, they are owned by different corporations. Media, Facebook is a really good example of transnational corporations as well. But these are companies that exist across a variety of countries, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they sell things across a variety of countries, although they do in most of these cases. But it might be that they outsource certain jobs in some countries, they produce and manufacture things in some countries, and then they sell things in other countries. So thinking critically about globalization. So there's a lot of pro-arguments. Some of these arguments, and again, I'm not saying that these are true, these are not true. This is, of course, where I try to present you with ideas, and I try to present you with information so that you can determine what your own opinions are. So some of the arguments for globalization are that we have a more efficient world economy. What exactly they mean by that, I am not sure, but it could mean many things. I have my ideas, but I think what I call efficient and what the people who are pro quote-unquote efficient world economies, we have different ideas. Countries that embrace globalization have more economic success. Sometimes. Some of them do. And usually just the rich people. Economic convergence. Poor countries can catch up with rich countries. This is what they keep saying. They've been saying it for 80, 90 years. It still hasn't happened. Maybe a couple lucky countries have, but most of them don't. Any others? If you can think of any others, and if we were in a class, I'd encourage you to offer a few other answers. So critics, their argument: it's not a natural process, but the product of economic policy promoted by capitalism, financial interests, investors, TNC, or transnational corporations. Everything that we talk about, everything that we consider are social constructs. Social constructs, we will talk about this, basically means that people have made them. We have created them. Globalization is not a natural process, they're saying. It's not something like evolution. It's not something like climate. It is a process. It is a thing. It exists because we've made it, because we've created this beast, and it's largely fueled and based on capitalism, which is not necessarily a great economic model, which, capitalism was meant to, or professed to, decrease the gap between the rich and the poor, but that just didn't happen, and it's not happening. So again, sorry, I get ahead of myself. Greater economic disparity. The richest 20%, we are included in this as Americans, consume 86% of the resources. Even if you are very poor and you're saying, well, I don't even make anything above, I could qualify for food stamps, for example. You still are part of the consumption of the 86% of resources that are consumed. I know there was the thing, the Occupy Wall Street, they talk about the 1% owning everything. But when it comes down to it, the 1% of the world, even our 99% in the United States, our level of poverty, our concept of poverty, the United States, or the United Nations just came and did a study a little while ago. They're looking at some countries, there's some states in the South and they were studying the disparities between the rich and the poor, and they were commenting. The report, included, this is absolutely appalling to think that there are so many people living in such squalor situations and are in having such poor, economic situations and social and um, such a horrible access to resources, food deserts, food insecurities, even in the United States. Yet, even in the worst of the worst, the people in the States tend not to be that bad compared to other countries. When we look at the poor of the poor in Somalia, we really don't compare. So job loss to outsourcing, this is a huge factor that has happened around the world. If we look at the free trade agreement we signed with China in the 1990s, late 1990s, which was signed with the Clinton administration, we have seen even more outsourcing. We've lost a lot of our manufacturing industry in the United States as a result of this as well. The wealthy 1%, so it goes back to that, in the United States. So this gap, this is a criticism of this, and I strongly agree with that one too. The rich versus the poor. And the economic disparity, this is something I think millennials should be very angry about if you're not already. You guys are, I have a cousin, he's probably in his early 50s, and he will constantly make comments about, oh, well, you guys can't complain and this and that. You just want things for free. And I'm like, okay. And he'll make the argument that him and his wife worked, and they had a little car, and they had a little house, and they worked to pay themselves through college. Well, yeah, but minimum wage wasn't that much less than what it is today. And college tuition was a lot less than what it was today. So you guys as college students today but it's ridiculous. Like for the state of Hawaii, you have to have like 2 or 3 full-time jobs just to pay your rent, just to survive. And then on top of that, college tuition, and then the college debt that most people, the tuition, the student debt that people get, it's absolutely ridiculous. There is the gap between the wealthy and the poor in this country continues to grow, and it continues to grow every year. There's a lot of environmental problems related to globalization, which we will talk about. Economic recessions that are felt throughout the world. Cultural homogenization. So is it the McDonaldization? Is everywhere becoming like the United States? As you'll see, this is not really the actual problem, but there is a little bit of homogenization that happens. So paradoxes in a global world. Globalization is unavoidable. Bottom line, we can't stop it. Its influence is pervasive, and its benefits and costs are uneven. There's nothing we can do to change that. Globalization is continuously promoted, suppressed, and negotiated, depending on who is doing each of these, where the power is held, and where we are talking about. As a result, we see these tensions throughout the world regions. Tradition versus change, scarcity and affluence, fragmentation and unity. So globalization is contradictory. It can be empowering, it can be coercive. It can homogenize culture, but it also enables people to share their uniqueness farther and wider. It can democratize opportunities, and it can spread exploitation. If I actually go back to homogenization of culture, it has actually strengthened some cultures in an attempt to prevent homogenization or Americanization. It can democratize opportunities, and it can spread exploitation. So it can make improvements, and it can make things worse. So recap, globalization is not a new phenomenon, but it occurs faster and has a wider effect than ever before in human history. So, are you pro? Are you against? Are you contradicted over globalization? Again, if this were a class, we would go ahead and discuss this a little bit, but just to kind of think, this introduction of globalization after reading this chapter as well. How do you feel about it? Are you pro-globalization? Are you against it? Are you contradicted? Most people, I think, would probably be contradicted. There are things that are really good about globalization, and there are things that are really bad about globalization. And where do you think we can go from this point in history? It's a huge, pretty rhetorical question. But what do we do? And this is something that I would like you to consider thinking about throughout the semester as well. So anyways, thank you. Have a great day. And we've only got one more lecture for this week. Have a great one.